Hi there and welcome to Biographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Marilyn Monroe, the ultimate Hollywood sex symbol, by Radio Alexander. Fame is like caviar. It's good to have caviar, but not when you have it for every meal. Those were the words of Marilyn Monroe, and indeed, fame proved to be a double-edged sword for the sultry platinum-blond actress. Outwardly, she projected the image of a silly, self-assured, sexy airhead who had all the men bowing at her feet. It was an archetype that played well in Hollywood and had done for many years prior to Monroe, but after Monroe, she made it her own. Even now, over half a century later, the notion of the blonde bombshell makes many people instantly think of Marilyn Monroe, perhaps in that iconic white dress getting swept up by a gust of passing wind. Behind closed doors, however, everything was not okay. First, Marilyn endured an unhappy childhood where she was moved around from place to place and eventually pressured into a marriage she didn't really want just to avoid the orphanage. Deep-seated feelings of abandonment and not being wanted haunted her throughout her life and had an adverse effect on her relationships and her career. Eventually, her demons got the best of her and Marilyn ended her life at the tender age of 36, when she was still at the apex of her career. Her time in Hollywood then was surprisingly brief, but her legacy as one of cinema's most legendary stars is everlasting. As the pub quiz aficionados amongst you will know, Marilyn Monroe was born Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1st, 1926 in Los Angeles, California, although she was soon baptized as Norma Jean Baker after her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker. When Norma Jean was born, Gladys was struggling both mentally and financially and was in no position to be a mother. Her first marriage, which resulted in 2 children, proved abusive and ended when she was only 19 years old. Her ex-husband then kidnapped their children and took them to his native Kentucky, where he started a new life for himself. Gladys spent what little money she had to track down her kids, but ultimately let them go, since they had a better life in Kentucky than she could provide back for them back in Los Angeles. In 1924, Gladys married again, but this relationship only lasted for a few months before the couple separated. After that, Gladys had a string of lovers and soon became pregnant with Norma Jean, who we'll just call Marilyn from now on to avoid confusion. Nobody was really sure who Marilyn's father was, nobody other than Gladys herself, who insisted that the father was a man named Charles Stanley Gifford, a sales manager at Consolidated Studios where Gladys worked as a film cutter. However, she had no way of proving this at the time, it was just a gut instinct and that wasn't good enough for Gifford, who knew that Gladys had been with other men and wanted nothing to do with raising the child. Modern technology, however, has vindicated Gladys Baker's instincts, as a recent DNA test concluded that Gifford was indeed Marilyn Monroe's father. As far as we know, Marilyn never met her father. She tried once but only ran into his wife. Unsurprisingly, this had a profound impact on Monroe's development and she was often attracted to older men later in life and even called them dad or daddy. Truly a trailblazer. Normally, a baby's arrival is cause for a celebration, but not in this case. Gladys Baker had a history of depression and mood swings, as did her mother, Della, and those were greatly exacerbated by Marilyn's birth. It's likely that Gladys suffered from postpartum depression, but this was at a time when few people understood the condition and even fewer cared. Her mental state was undoubtedly made even worse by the stigma and shame that society bestowed upon single, unwed mothers at the time. At the very least, Gladys had the state of mind to understand that motherhood was just too much for her right then, and she agreed to give up Marilyn just 2 weeks after she was born. Well, agreed might be too strong a word. Her choice was hurried along after Gladys tried to stab a friend of hers after accusing her of poisoning her child. So on June 13th, baby Marilyn ended up in the home of Wayne and Ida Belender, who lived in Hawthorne, California, across the street from Marilyn's grandmother, Della Baker. Unfortunately, living close to Grandma wasn't all it was cracked up to be. One day during a visit, Ida Belender walked in on Della Baker trying to smother Marilyn in her crib. The police were called, and from then on, Della's mental state steadily deteriorated until she died about a year later. Marilyn spent the first 7 years of her life with the Belenders. Just how bad it was is, well, that's a matter of opinion. Later in life, Marilyn Monroe certainly talked up her rough childhood to emphasise her rags to riches story, saying that it was strict and religious and bordering on zealotry. But one of the Belenders' daughters disputed many of her claims, so who knows who's really telling the truth here. It's very full. I'm worried I'm going to spill it on my laptop or the mic, as funny as that would be for you, the audience at home. In 1993, Gladys got her life back on track and got Marilyn back. Under Roosevelt's New Deal, she had managed to obtain a loan for a down payment on a house near Hollywood Bowl, and while renting a bedroom to the Atkinson family, George and Maud, and their young daughter, Nellie. Like Gladys Baker, the Atkinsons were on the periphery of Hollywood, with both husband and wife occasionally landing bit parts in movies. They were also a lot looser than Ida Belender. They liked to smoke, drink, dance, and play cards. All the fun stuff that sends you straight to hell. But Marilyn still liked and enjoyed hearing about all the stories in Hollywood, and for the first time she began wondering what such a life would be like for her. The new living arrangement seemed to work out pretty well, but a dark storm soon clouded the sunshine and rainbows. Just a few months after moving into the new house, Gladys received some dreadful news. Jackie, her boy from her first marriage, had died of tuberculosis. A short while later, she also found out that her grandmother had committed suicide after allegedly going mad. Even at the best of times, Gladys Baker's mental state was precarious, but 2 tragedies in a row sent her on a downward spiral. She lashed out at Marilyn, telling her she should have died instead of Jackie. Then one day she suffered a full-on psychotic break, brandishing a knife to protect herself from imaginary attackers. At that point, Gladys Baker was undoubtedly a danger to both herself and everybody around her, so the police were called and they sent her for a psychiatric evaluation. Gladys was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and committed to a mental hospital. The next years of Marilyn's life were a bit uncertain as she drifted between different homes and orphanages. In 1935, Marilyn thought she had found a new home with Grace McKee, her mother's dearest friend, and the same woman that Gladys once tried to stab after accusing her of poisoning Marilyn. After Gladys was committed, Grace became Marilyn's legal guardian, but now that she had her, she decided there were other things she wanted more. Grace McKee had just gotten married for the 4th time to a man who already had 3 kids. A middle-aged woman, she was desperate to hang on to this husband, so when he said that 3 kids were enough and that Marilyn had to go, she relented and sent her back to the orphanage. And Marilyn had it rough. Marilyn spent about 1.5 years in the Los Angeles orphans' home. She described it as one of the darkest periods of her life, but just like her years with the Belenders, orphanage officials have accused her of making up most of the horrible things she described, possibly to give herself more of a tragic and compelling backstory. Again, since nobody's pants caught on fire, we're not really sure who was telling the truth in this situation. After leaving the orphanage, Marilyn was passed around like a beach volleyball. First, she stayed with Grace McKee and her family again, then she was sent to live with her elderly aunt, Anna Lower, when the aunt became too sickly to look after her. Like, the girl returned to Grace for a bit, then the whole family was planning to move to Virginia, and Marilyn wasn't invited along for the trip. Faced with the possibility of returning to the orphanage, Marilyn looked for an alternative, any alternative, and she found that in the boy next door, James Doherty. Marilyn and James were already sweet on each other, and she was just about to turn 16, so they thought, why not get married? That never goes wrong. So they did, and they got hitched in 1942, soon after Marilyn came of legal age with Grace's full support. That way, McKee could pack up and move to Virginia with a clear conscience. That same year, Marilyn dropped out of high school and became a housewife, while Doherty worked at the Lockheed factory in Van Nuys. But just like every other new arrangement in Monroe's life, this one was short-lived. In 1943, Doherty joined the Merchant Navy, so the couple relocated to Catalina Island. A year later, he got shipped to the Pacific, so Marilyn went to the Van Nuys again and moved in with her in-laws, and then soon after that she found her first job with a company called Radioplane, which manufactured drones that were used for gunnery targets. And who could have foreseen that it would be here, in of all places, that Marilyn Monroe would emerge as a star? One day in late 1944, a man walked into the Radioplane offices. His name was David Conover, and he was a photographer with Yank magazine, a military publication during World War II. He was looking to do a morale-boosting feature on women in the workplace to show the lads who were deployed what they were fighting for. Several women posed for Conover, but Marilyn immediately caught his eye. He saw something in her and concluded that she would make a great pin-up model. And he was right. Conover used Marilyn several more times and spread the word about this new great girl he discovered, and she became a hit overnight with dozens of photo shoots in her first year as a model alone. This caused, shall we say, tensions with her husband, who was not happy about his wife's new career. Doherty was old school. He wrote Marilyn a letter where he made it clear that once he was back, he expected her to settle down, give up a modelling career, and start a family. But that didn't sit well with Marilyn. She wasn't the scared, innocent girl needing to be saved that she was when they got married. Now Marilyn could look after herself, and she was not about to give up a flourishing career just because somebody else told her to. In 1946, Jim Doherty came back home. His feelings had not changed at all, so Marilyn was forced to make a decision: her marriage or her career. I think we all know that she chose the latter, divorcing Doherty that same year. Her personal life might have taken a hit, but professional life was just one success after another. In February 1946, for example, Marilyn made the inspired decision to change her look a little. So she straightened her curls, dyed her hair blonde, and added her signature beauty mark. She wanted to resemble her idol, Jean Harlow, Hollywood's original blonde bombshell, and someone who, incidentally, we've already covered here at Biographics. Link somewhere on screen with our previous, more aerodynamic host. This new look made Marilyn even more popular, and inevitably came the transition to movies. Everyone kept telling her she was pretty enough to be in the pictures, so a modelling agent, Emily Snively, arranged a screen test between Marilyn and Ben Lyon, a recruiter for 20th Century Fox. Studio bigwig Daryl Zanuck was exactly bowled over by her performance, but he was sufficiently impressed to want to keep her away from the competition, so he put the budding star on the payroll. $75 a week for 6 months with the option for the studio to renew at double the salary. All that was missing was a name, because Norma Jean Baker didn't exactly scream glitz and glamour, so the actress started to use the first name Marilyn after Broadway star Marilyn Miller and her mother's maiden name, Monroe. And thus the transformation from Norma Jean Mortensen to Marilyn Monroe was complete. So now she had the name and she had the look, but it was still a while before she had the star power. As we said, 20th Century Fox didn't immediately see box office gold in her, so she spent her first 6 months on contract without actually appearing in any movies. But she still got paid. That's the important thing. Always get paid. She used that time to take acting, singing and dancing lessons, with the occasional appearance at press layouts where all those expect of her was to smile and look pretty, something she'd been doing for years. Finally, in February 1947, the 21-year-old Monroe landed her first acting gig, a bit part in the movie Dangerous Years, where she played a waitress. A few more roles followed, but they were all small time, and some even uncredited. And admittedly, uncredited appearances are the way a lot of actors cut their teeth. Like, fun fact, Jennifer Aniston's first role in a feature film was in the infamous McDonald's dance scene in Mac and Me. Blink and you'd miss it, but you can find it on YouTube. It's probably in the comments links, because why would you not highlight that? She was also in Leprechaun 1 and 2. Oh no, it was Leprechaun 1. Yeah, she's in Leprechaun 1. And watch that movie, because it is just an absolute showcase of style. Now clearly she had not impressed anyone with her acting chops, so when her second contract expired, Fox did not renew it. She signed a new deal with Columbia in 1948, but this went even worse. Although Marilyn landed her first ever leading role in Ladies of the Chorus, the movie was a bomb, and the studio dropped her like a hot potato soon after release. I wonder if they came to get her out one. Like, yeah, we signed Marilyn Monroe. Like, nah, we good. So Marilyn returned to modelling to pay the bills. This was when she also posed nude for the pin-up photographer Tom Kelly under the name Mona Monroe. It wasn't something she was proud of, but she needed to make a car payment, and Kelly promised that nobody would recognise it was her. The last part didn't exactly work out, since Hugh Hefner infamously bought the photographs 4 years later, when Marilyn Monroe was a star, and he used them for the first issue of his new magazine, Playboy. It was starting to look like Marilyn Monroe might not be made for the movies after all. However, she had been told that you can never predict when you'll get your big break in Hollywood, but that when it happens, you'll know. And for Monroe, it happened on New Year's Eve 1949 at the party of producer Sam Spiegel, when she shook the hand of Johnny Hyde. At first glance, Johnny Hyde was nothing to look at. He was a short, balding, middle-aged man with a sickly appearance and a bad ticker. But as the vice president of the William Morris Talent Agency, he was also one of the most powerful men in the room. And the moment he laid eyes on Marilyn, he was smitten. His proposition to her was exactly what you'd expect. Become his mistress, and he'll make her a star. Never change, Hollywood. Never change. That's sarcastic, by the way. The delivery was just very dry. Although by the end of their year-long relationship, the power dynamic had shifted completely, and it was Hyde who was working non-stop to please Monroe, terrified that she might leave him while she constantly rebuffed his marriage proposals. Get it, girl. Admittedly, on a professional level, Hyde did deliver on his promises. He knew that Marilyn wanted, more than anything else, to be seen as a serious actress, not just a sexy airhead, so he got her a role in John Huston's film noir, The Asphalt Jungle, in 1950. Although Monroe only had a few minutes of screen time, it was the first time she received praise for her acting. That same year, she had another minor role in one of the greatest movies of all time, the seminal drama All About Eve, which is still tied with Titanic for record for most Oscar nominations, with 14. Again, another one out there for you pub quiz aficionados. These two hits were followed by several mediocre films that only became noteworthy because they included a young Marilyn Monroe. Otherwise, they would have been doomed to irrelevancy as soon as they were released. But Hyde wanted any roles he could for Monroe, hoping that if she got featured enough, one of the big studios would eventually notice and offer a contract. Ultimately, he got his wish, and in December 1950, 20th Century Fox offered Monroe a new 7-year contract. With his job done, Hyde had a heart attack and died a few days later. I don't know why. The way that's written's really tickled me. just like, his only goal was like, yeah, it's like, just imagining on his deathbed of like, yes, I'm okay with this. Monroe's famous now. Oh, just like Vegeta doing the final flash. It's like, I've never embraced you as I've never acknowledged you as an actress, Marilyn. Stricken with grief, Marilyn blamed herself for his heart attack. I can see why an older man with a bad heart getting to be with Marilyn Monroe at 20 years old would cause an old man's heart to give out. But blaming herself and feeling a lot of grief for it, Marilyn attempted to commit suicide a few days after the funeral. Her acting coach found her passed out in bed with several sleeping pills still dissolving in her mouth. This likely being her first attempt at killing herself, Marilyn didn't take enough pills to get the job done, and her coach was able to remove the pills from her mouth and shake her awake. Marilyn would later completely dismiss the event as an accident, but she had already begun abusing the pills to cope with the disappointments in her life, a habit that only got worse as the years went on. After High's death, Marilyn went on a much publicised string of short-lived, high-profile affairs, including with director Ella Kazan, actor Peter Lawford, who would later introduce her to the Kennedys. This culminated in her second marriage, this time to New York Yankees star player Joe DiMaggio, which only lasted 9 months. On a professional level, Monroe's career didn't exactly flop, but it has stagnated. During the early 1950s, she made a bunch of moderately successful movies for Fox Studios, where she was once again relegated to playing the sexy dumb blonde. There were some exceptions, such as the noir Clash by Night and the thriller Don't Bother to Knock, but Monroe was still looking for that breakout role to launch a career into the stratosphere. 1953 was the year that made Monroe's career. She started the year by appearing in the film noir Niagara, or Niagara. I'm not sure how you Americans pronounce it. I've always pronounced it Niagara. What Niagara is, I've also heard. So just either one of those, right? Let me know in the comments, I suppose. Well, she played a femme fatale who was still heavy on the sex appeal, but less so on the ditziness that defined most of her roles. Later that year, she starred in the movie adaptation of the comedy musical that was seemingly written for her, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, where she showcased her singing and dancing skills in her memorable rendition of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. Monroe finished off the year by starring in the comedy movie How to Marry a Millionaire alongside Lauren Bacall and Betty Grable. All 3 movies were big hits and cemented Monroe's status as one of Hollywood's greatest rising stars. Her second stint at Fox was capped off by the Billy Wilder comedy The 7-Year Itch, which featured arguably one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, when Monroe's white cocktail dress gets blown upwards by the wind from a subway train passing underneath. And I'm hoping we can show this, because it is a still from a movie, but whenever it comes to these iconic images, there's always somebody out there who bought the rights to it and charged us money for putting it in there. So if we did, yeah. At this point, Marilyn Monroe had become undisputed Hollywood royalty, but she was still bothered by the blonde airhead archetype she kept portraying. She butted heads several times with Fox execs over her parts, as they felt any other roles would be unsuited to her. Eventually, she said, screw that, and moved to New York, where she opened her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. 20th Century Fox, however, begged to differ and insisted that Monroe was still under contract with them. This launched a year-long legal battle between the two sides, a time during which some ridiculed Monroe for torpedoing her own career, while others applauded her for taking on the big studios to support actors' rights. Eventually, the two sides reached an agreement that was very favourable to Monroe, with her receiving not only a big pay increase, but also the ability to choose her own projects and directors. It was a landmark moment that signalled the beginning of the end for the studio system. Monroe's movie under her new deal was the drama Bus Stop, where she downplayed her sex appeal and spoke with an Ozark accent. Both the movie and her acting were all well received, proving to the world that Marilyn Monroe was not just a one-trick pony. The next film, however, The Prince and the Showgirl, wasn't quite as successful, marred by conflicts between the movie's two leads, Monroe and Laurence Olivier. In fact, by that point, Monroe had firmly established having a reputation as, let's put it diplomatically, difficult to work with. She was someone who always showed up late, often forgot her lines, and demanded countless retakes until she felt that everything was right. This attitude caused the most problems on the set of one of her final and undoubtedly one of her best, Billy Wilder's comedy, Some Like It Hot. By the end of production, the director was not speaking to Monroe anymore, and he later made multiple disparaging comments about her in the press. Wilder put it bluntly to the press, stating that while Marilyn was good, she probably wasn't worth all the trouble, capping it off by stating, I'm too old and too rich to ever go through something like that again. And if anyone's curious about the exact details of how this went down, it's reported that Marilyn took about 30 to 50 takes to say the words like, good night sugar. Because she couldn't remember the exact intonation of how to say it. And this understandably caused the director to be incredibly frustrated, to the point where the lines were written on a piece of paper in front of her and she still got it wrong. I actually wrote about that for Top Tens a few years ago. If the edit can remember or keeps this bit in, maybe the link that below. Although Marilyn's career had its ups and downs, her personal life seemed to be a string of disappointments, heartbreaks, and failure. She married playwright Arthur Miller in 1956, and although this was her longest marriage, it still ended in divorce in 1961. Afterwards, it is presumed that she had her infamous affair with President Kennedy and his brother, Bobby Kennedy, although it has never been definitively proven. In fact, many people believe a popular conspiracy theory that says the Kennedys were somehow involved in Marilyn's death, which included her second husband, Joe DiMaggio. Behind closed doors, Marilyn was also dealing with a host of health problems. She suffered 2 miscarriages and 1 ectopic pregnancy in her life, and also had to deal with very painful gallstones. Her physical and emotional pain made her turn to drugs, and by the end of her life, she became addicted to barbiturates. While filming her final movie, Something's Got to Give, Monroe had to take an extended sick leave, which prompted Fox to fire her and seek a replacement. However, by now you think the studio would have learned that they always got the short end of the stick when they went up against the force of nature that was Marilyn Monroe. Her co-star Dean Martin refused to work with anybody else. Eventually the studio rehired her with a pay rise, not just for this movie, but also for her next one. Monroe stood to earn around $1 million for 2 movies, a giant sum in those days. The studio would never have to pay out though, because on the evening of August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe died in her home from a barbiturate overdose. The 36-year-old actor's death was officially ruled a probable suicide, although, as we mentioned, there are quite a few conspiracy theories that surround her untimely demise. The end result is that Marilyn Monroe's life, her career, and yes, even her tragic death combine to form one of the most popular and enduring figures in Hollywood history. So cheers to everyone for tuning into this episode of Biographics. As mentioned at the start, I'm your interim host, Cal Smallwood. I used to write for Top 10s a few years ago, and they asked me to step in due to my experience hosting my own channel, Fact Fiend with Cal Smallwood, which you can no doubt find linked below. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And remember, as always, to have the day you deserve. It's a Hello Kitty mug. It was my sister's and I stole it because I'm a good big brother.